What is going on with food prices? Is the Russia-Ukraine conflict going to lead to global food shortages? And is the incredibly hot summer that we're having here in the United States and in Europe going to damage food production even further? These are the questions that we are going to talk about today with Dan Basse on Global Macro Update. Dan Basse heads the firm Ag Resource. He sits at the juncture of economics and agriculture, and Ag Resource provides consulting services and research services to grain processors, importers, investors, large food production companies, basically anyone who needs to understand what's happening in the agricultural commodity market. So Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, Ed, I'm so glad to be with you. There's much to talk about, and I think you hit some of the three highlights to start out with here.
Well, Dan, I was looking at the USDA website earlier today, and the most up-to-date information that I can get, maybe you have better information, but what the USDA is reporting is from June, and they're saying that as of June of this year, year over year, food inflation at the grocery store is up 12.2%, which is affecting everyone. And that's what, 3 or 4 times higher than the normal food inflation amount? Is that correct?
Yeah, no, if we look backwards in time over the last decade, we've been hanging in that 0.5 to 1.25% on food inflation for most of that period. I have to go all the way back to 78, 79, where we can find food inflation like this in the United States. Globally, it's even worse than that, Ed. I mean, if you look at the UN's FAO food index, we are now at record highs. We've come off in the last couple of months, but I think it's only temporary. As you think about the price of food here and globally, it's likely to keep rising. Unfortunately, whether it's due to climate policy or other things, we're in a different world today.
Well, Dan, what are the big drivers? I mean, I touched on a few things, but as we were chatting before we started the interview here, it's the most complex environment for almost any market that I can think of. The stock market, commodity markets, bond markets, anything. What is driving this food inflation that we're experiencing, and how long do you think it will last?
Well, if I look backwards in the last year, Ed, last year was the first year that the world produced a record grain crop and we still consumed more of it. And so the pressures, if you will, on food production is rising. And then we've got something in the United States. We've never seen this before. We call it peak farmland. We have run out, or we have reached the ceiling, maybe is a better way to say it, in terms of arable land that can be pulled into production. For the last 10 years, we've been pulling land out of hay. So as corn, soybean, and wheat, these are the 3 pillars as we think about it on the food chain. As we've been pulling acres from hay, a forage crop for cattle, into grain, that's now, of course, a problem because we now have U.S. hay acres at their lowest level since 1907. And at the same time, Secretary Vilsack at the USDA wants to increase a program called Conservation Reserve Program. These are fragile farmlands, which USDA started to pull away from the market all the way back in 1986. He would like to increase it 3 or 4 million. But as we look at the pie of farmland available, excluding hay, we're about 270 million acres, and we can vacillate 1 million acres either side. But farmers no longer in the United States have the ability to just reach back and say, hey, we're going to fix this problem with more acres. They're just not there.
Dan, why aren't they there? Is it an issue of land being developed? Is it an issue of climate changes affecting what's arable? What's driving that? That's a huge number, 270 million acres.
Yeah, there's about 320 to 325 million acres all combined that can be utilized for agricultural purposes. The United States is blessed with the middle and eastern part of the country being very fertile. And so those acres, if you will, are pretty much all being utilized. Outside of the 21 or 22 million acres that I mentioned before in this Conservation Reserve Program, which the Biden administration likes because of it helps watersheds, it helps wildlife. It's kind of seen as an environmental win, if you will. And so excluding those, we have just run out of what I would call farmable acres. By that I'm saying topsoil, subsoil, the ingredients that go to produce crops in size or substance that makes a farmer profitable. And so, as I said, there may be a few more acres, but we've we've been also urbanization and urbanizing farmland for many, many years. That will persist. We just can't find any additionality. And so maybe if we think forward and we can pull some land into Arizona or other places through irrigation, that would be fine. But as you see all the stories in the West and water shortages and all of that, I'm afraid we're going to be losing acres there, not gaining them.
So how much of a shortfall, if any, is there in the U.S. when it comes to our ability to produce our own food? Are we a net importer, and what does that look like?
Well, we are still a net exporter of food. We still export significant amounts of corn, soybeans, and wheat. Let's also remember that we utilize about 40% of our U.S. corn crop every year for the production of ethanol. So it's not like we're going to be running out in terms of a food substance for human beings. However, we will see prices that are now elevated. We're looking at new price plateaus or ranges, if I can use that word, that we will now be going forward. And I can look all the way back into the middle of the Civil War, and I can find that over time, these plateaus, if you will, in grain prices and food prices have been indeed moving up. What it really tells me is that now if we think about the world, we need to think about additional acres coming into production. Global grain demand, as of those three pillars again, are expanding about 1.8% every year. So as we get more people, as demographics improve, I need to see food production globally expanding. And that globalization and expansion of food consumption has been ongoing since the 2000 timeframe. Even the great reset of the recession back in 0809 didn't cause really global grain and global food consumption to go down. So with the United States now maxed out on its farmland, we now have to look at South America. Can it bring in an additional, we believe, 20 to 25 million acres in the next 5 years to meet the global demand that we're talking about? Friends in the Black Sea at the time, Ukraine, Russia, I mean, they're in conflict. They're not pulling additionality in terms of land into production. So it's got to come from down there. I just got back from Brazil on Saturday. They are doing what they can, but we're going to be encroaching on more and more of the rainforest, something I fear you're going to be seeing in the news going forward.
I was in Brazil perhaps a decade ago, actually looking at agricultural land, and what struck me was just the size and scale of that country. It's so big. The amount of resources seem almost endless. Do you think that they have what it takes also in terms of policy and procedure to be able to deliver on that promise that you reference?
Well, the world really needs it. Of course, first of all, Brazil has a presidential election happening in October between Bolsonaro and an old president named Lula that recently got out of jail. We'll see how this all falls out. When you talk about policy in Brazil, I kind of shake my head a little bit because of those kinds of things. But there is a desire from the farmer in Brazil, and we work with several of them. I have an office in Sao Paulo. They are anxious to reap this opportunity. Where we run short a little bit is we calculate 18 to 19 million acres in what we call the cerrados, outside of the rainforest. And so that land can be grabbed, but increasingly, the world, as we get to where we think global peak farmland, which will be in that 2050 to 2060 timeframe, it's key that Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay and some of those Latin American countries continue to come forward with expansion, because globally, China, the United States, Europe, we're just running out of that ability to hit the gas or hit the accelerator and get more land going forward. And so that's something we really need to think about as humankind, of where we are in agriculture, and why I believe that food prices globally and domestically are going to be so sticky as an economist as we think about the next 5 to 10 years.
So are you predicting continued food inflation? Are you predicting that it levels out? I'm assuming that you're not predicting it goes back down from where we are.
Yeah, we're not forecasting that it goes back down. And here's our big, real concern for the food markets as we go forward. I've been doing this, as I said, for 44 years now. And if I look back even another 40 or 50 years before that, there's one trend that farmers do really well, and that's farmers always want to farm their crops better. They invest in seed and technology, better agronomics, better fertilization rates. We find that planting more seeds per acre helps yields. And so we've been doing this all the way back since World War II. However, in the last 4 to 5 years, and last year's data is still coming in, we've noticed that global crop yields have plateaued. In other words, we're not seeing those same gains that were once evident looking backwards to, post World War II. And so it was a head scratcher for AgResource. We did a lot of work and did a lot of diving into it and what was happening on a region by region, country by country basis. And what we really found is that climate change is really now starting to hit, if you will, some of these global crop yields. And so when I use that number of an additionality of 20, 25 million acres, I'm thinking that we need normal global weather. But if we continue to have what we're talking in our office called heatflation, which is where we look around the world and temperatures are rising to levels that are adverse to crops, then that acreage number goes even higher. But global crop yields have plateaued, which is something we've not seen for that a period of time. And it's a concern to us relative to Mother Nature.
Wow. How does the Russia-Ukraine conflict factor into all of this, and what regions of the world would be most affected if that conflict continues much longer?
Well, the Russians and Ukrainians combined account for about 30% of world wheat production and trade. They account for about 78 to 79% of a strange crop called sun oil. In that part of the world, sun oil comes from sunflower seeds. It's their popular vegetable oil. They like the fry ingredients in it. And then, of course, if I look at corn, it's a little less than that. It's somewhere around 19%. So think about wheat, barley, 30%, corn, 17 to 19%, and then sun oil, 78 or 79%. Those are the major crops that come from that neck of the woods. Now, the people that would be affected, of course, we in the United States import very little in terms of barley or sun oil or any of the other ingredients from the Black Sea. But it really affects the Middle East and, of course, our friends throughout much of Africa. North Africa, in particular, are very big importers, along with Turkey, who is kind of the wheat miller of the world. So if you think about wheat and wheat flour, it comes from Russia and Ukraine into the Bosphorus. The Turks then take it and mill it into flour and then send it to a lot of North and Central Africa, which feed those people. I'd also include Bangladesh in that whole list. But it's very, very important in terms of this part of the world for the impoverished of the world. Those that do less than $3 a day, they are really struck by this conflict. We don't think we're in a food crisis today, but we are one weather event or one, let's say, climatic event or a political event, like a continuation of this war before it all tips over.
And China, how does China factor into all of this?
So China's been the country that, if you look at China, they, whether through their own smarts or their own policy, has the biggest cache of grain of any country in the world. They are sitting on about half of the world wheat stocks. They are sitting about 27% of the world corn stocks. Yes, they do have the world's largest hog herd, being about 5 times larger than the United States. But for whatever reason, the Chinese have planned ahead very aptly and are sitting on large supplies of grain. Now, their Achilles heel in agriculture would be their importation of soybeans, principally produced soybean meal and soybean oil. The soybean meal goes to their hog herds. Of course, they consume the soybean oil as a human, but that would be, of course, one thing that they would look at. But on the grain side of things, they are sitting on large supplies. In fact, to the point that it's angered Mr. Beasley, who runs the World Food Program, to the point that they were looking for extra supplies to come to the world. China had them, but China said, nope, we are not exporting them to those in need. So look for the Chinese to be very smug as they sit in those caches of grain going forward.
Dan, fascinating conversation. This last question I have for you has to do with this trend of deglobalization that was really accelerated by COVID. How much interdependence is there globally tied to food production? And I'm thinking about things like fertilizer that only come from a few areas of the world. Is this trend going to impact agriculture? And do you have any national security concerns related to food production?
Well, you surely would in terms of food production. When you start looking at the main ingredients of fertilizer, which is nitrogen, potassium, and potash, and all those kind of things, you start to focus on Belarus and Russia as providing about 43% of the world's needs. And then if you look at China, which is the big phosphate producer, they, of course, would be key exporters to the world there. I think 2023 is going to be the year of fertilizer. I think that as I look at data from our friends in Russia and Belarus, if I look at China recently putting export quotas on phosphate exports, and then I think about the United States, which over the last month has been exporting about 50% of its nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of the key ingredients in terms of yields each year. We are now exporting that to the EU. Of course, EU gas prices, natural gas prices, are up substantially, 5 to 7 to 8-fold. We in the United States have a larger supply, but with that, when you make nitrogen, it comes from natural gas. So our fertilizer per se is being exported overseas because of a higher price and higher profitability. So as I think forward, there will be shortages, maybe not in Latin America. One of the reasons I visited Brazil for the last 10 days is trying to understand if they had enough fertilizer to lay in for their soybean crop that will be started to be planted in early September. It looks like they do. And so Bolsonaro and the Brazilians have done a very good job on that. But as I shift the needle to the northern hemisphere, when we start planting crops next April in May of 2023, that's when I start to have concerns about availability and could there be spot shortages, principally of nitrogen, which would be a big concern for corn.
Dan, I really appreciate your time on this fascinating conversation, and I have yet to have heard the term peak farmland, but that's concerning. Everything that you said is pretty concerning.
Well, it's something to be watching. And Ed, as we got high grain prices, I want all of the listeners to understand the next cycle, which will kick in here, is high livestock prices. Because livestock producers have been liquidating their herds for about the last 3 years, and this drought across the West has been so encompassing for the last 3 or 4 years. Cattle numbers are plummeting. And so it takes 3 years to get a calf on the ground and get the next animal to market. We're going to be looking at beef shortages sometime in 2023 and beyond. Hogs and chickens are a little more flexible in their production cycles, but it's something we really need to pay attention to.
Dan, I lied. I have one more question since this is such an interesting topic. California seems to be losing more and more of its arable land to drought and fire. Yeah. What is the impact on, that was the breadbasket of much of the country. What's the impact on U.S. food prices? And is there anything that can be done to solve the drought issues that California farmland is facing?
Well, Mother Nature can solve some of them for us if she wants to be kind, but I really think longer term we need to be thinking about desalination and some other opportunities to get water. Water is the big ingredient here, and whether it's an avocado grove or pistachios or leafy greens that we all enjoy every day, that is where we're going to see it in our pocketbooks going forward. So, watch the Colorado River, watch what's going on in Las Vegas in terms of Lake Powell and all of those sorts of things. But I really think in the future, water is going to have a more prominent discussion at USDA and around our own food tables. And I say that because California is that supplier of those leafy vegetables and fruits that we like so much. But going forward, this drought, which is ongoing, has been devastating to so many farmers out there that I'm worried about overall supplies as we turn the page to 2023.
Dan Basse from Ag Resource. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Ed.
Thanks for watching this interview with Dan Basse of Ag Resource, talking about peak farmland and food prices moving forward. Pretty sobering conversation, but fascinating nonetheless. This has been a Global Macro Update. I'm Ed D'Agostino from Alden Economics. If you found this helpful, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next week.